It's an emotional moment to be in this hall for reasons that I think you can understand. All us CU veterans feel a very special feeling about this room, and so it's wonderful to see it used, and particularly for this purpose. It's an honor to be asked to provide the entertainment at this concluding session. I say entertainment because I'm not a social scientist, I'm not a political scientist, I'm just a historian, and so all a historian can offer a crowd like this is diversion. But, and I can't compete with the scholarly firepower that's been on display and has been brought together by this wonderful project under Zsolt's leadership. All I can say as a former rector of CU is to observe that this project that Zsolt has led to a successful conclusion does honor to this university. It does honor to our vocation as a defender of free inquiry and academic freedom right in the heart of an illiberal society. Yeah, CU is in Vienna now, but we haven't left Hungary, and let me tell you, we never will. We remain committed as scholars and thinkers to academic scholarship that uncovers the genesis, rationale, and fault line of these illiberal regimes. And this project, and you've been part of it for years, is a triumphant demonstration that we've kept faith with this university's basic intellectual commitments. So I want to use this moment to thank all of you for joining us, and particularly want to thank Zsolt for his extraordinary leadership. Now, I'm a historian of human rights and international relations, among other themes. And so what I want to talk to you about is a theme that I'm not sure has perhaps had the salience that it might have had in your discussions, which is the interaction between illiberalism in national politics and emerging trends in geopolitics. I think the looming question about the rise of illiberal regimes around the world is whether liberal democracy can even survive in a world that is increasingly divided into competitive spheres of influence, each dominated by illiberal regimes. If you're in Europe, there's the Russian-Eurasian sphere of influence on the eastern border, not too far away. And when Europe faces westward, it looks across the Atlantic to something it hasn't seen in my lifetime, which is an imperial regime that has jettisoned its commitment to European democracy, is indifferent to European freedom, and might even conceivably use force to conquer European territory, namely Greenland. And this is a surprising world to be in. The transatlantic commitment to European security after 1948 was the precondition for the emergence of the European single market, the precondition for the consolidation of liberal democracy. And so the collapse of this commitment potentially opens up the possibility of the slow disintegration of the European project itself and the simultaneous erosion of democracy across 27 nation states. Now, this used to be what the psychologists call catastrophizing. That is, exaggerated projections of rational fears. But I don't think this is catastrophizing. I think one of the things we all have to think about is that these are entirely thinkable thoughts now. They're rational extrapolations of current trends, things we notice every morning when we open the news. As a historian, I would also say that these are extrapolations of Europe's lived experience in the past. It's not a prediction of the future. It's an echo of certain deep trends in the past, particularly in the interwar period between 1918 and 1939. In that period, there was a very strong negative relationship between authoritarian consolidation in the geopolitical sphere and the waning of liberal democracy in the domestic sphere. Hungary is a pretty good example of this, as everyone in this audience will know better than I. The collapse of Austro-Hungary and the Peace of Trianon created the geopolitical context, the context in which Hungary lost a substantial portion of its territory and lost a portion of its Hungarian-speaking population forever. That was the upheaval that made consolidating democracy in Hungary after World War I effectively impossible. A country traumatized by defeat, humiliation, and loss turned to a military leader, Admiral Horthy, whose authoritarian and increasingly anti-Semitic rule promised to reverse Trianon and regain lost territory and people. But it was an objective he could only obtain by allying with Hitler and Mussolini, with catastrophic results for Hungary and its democracy. I don't need to tell you, behind Orban to this very day lurks the vanished shade of Admiral Horthy and the authoritarian traditions that emerged from that geopolitical crisis between 1918 and 1944. Similarly, if you look in Poland, I'm no expert on Poland, if there are Poles here, please forgive me, but fear of Stalin to the east, fear of Hitler to the west, helps to explain the consolidation of authoritarian illiberalism under Pilsudski in the 1930s. Czechoslovakia is a little different. Masaryk and Beneš kept democracy alive in the Czech Republic through the 1930s, but League of Minority Rights guarantees were unable to protect national minorities, and the national minority issue in the Sudetenland gave Hitler the pretext he needed to abolish democratic Czechoslovakia altogether in 1938. And it's worth remembering that a similar pretext, the pretext that Ukrainians were persecuting the Russian minority in Ukraine, was a crucial part of the rationale that Putin gave publicly for his invasion in 22 and his project to abolish Ukrainian democracy altogether. I hardly need add, if you add Germany in the 1930s, the presence of the geopolitical context is crucial to explaining why Weimar democracy collapses. You have a Bolshevik state to the east. You have decadent Western democracies to the west, insisting on enforcing a punitive Versailles settlement. This sets up the context that Hitler exploits to crush Weimar democracy in 1933. Let's add America to the picture. It's a democracy, and its democracy survives the 1930s thanks to Roosevelt. But we need to remember that that whole period between 1918 and about 1942, America is an isolationist power, sees no necessary connection between its democracy and the fate of European democracy. Disillusion with the First World War leads the center of gravity of American international politics to shift to the right, and liberal voices warning about the rise of liberal authoritarianism in Europe never became strong enough to draw America into the war, and might not have drawn America into the war at all had it not been for Pearl Harbor. I make this obvious point because Europeans have taken the US commitment to European democracy for granted for so long that we've forgotten that isolationism has been an abiding feature of America's engagement with the world for a very long time. Behind President Trump stands Senator Robert Taft, Lindbergh, the aviator, and that rabble-rousing radio host, Father Coughlin. And so as America consolidates a sphere of influence in North and South America, which is a matter of some active concern to a Canadian like me, I think Europeans need to think that the Trump administration is not an aberration, but face up to the deep continuity of American engagement with the world, the deep continuity of its belief that its primary area of geostrategic domination has always been North and South America, and has been so since President Monroe declared the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. And we need to remember again that when America engaged in consolidating Europe in the ruins after 1945, it did so not from some abstract commitment to European democracy and holding back the tide of illiberal domestic politics. It was to contain and stabilize Stalinist expansion in Eastern Europe. That's why you have the Marshall Plan. That's why you have the creation of NATO in 1948. It was to anchor the western half of the continent securely in an American sphere of influence. American power did support efforts to drive communist competitors for power out of European domestic politics, but we need to remember that America was entirely happy to consolidate order in post-war Europe using a lot of illiberal regimes as the base. Salazar in Portugal, Franco in Spain, the colonels in Greece. Now, what made the Spanish and Portuguese and Greek transitions of democracy possible, what made it possible for the populations of those countries in my generation to consolidate democracy was in fact an American security guarantee, the economic expansion that was made possible by the Marshall Plan, the creation of a single market, the staggeringly evident failure of communism in Eastern Europe, combined with the memory of the catastrophe of fascism. But it would be a mistake to think that America was committed to anchor liberal democracy in Europe after 1945. It's a much more complicated story. And paradoxically, this is a thing that I find fascinating, America's commitment to Europe was strongest only when Soviet communism projected itself as an ideological alternative to capitalist democracy. Now that Russia projects nothing except the nihilist politics of a corrupt petro-state, America has concluded, not that surprisingly, that it has no remaining national security rationale to defend European democracy. That's the surprise. But maybe we should be less surprised when we think back to the history, where the connection between American commitment to Europe and democracy was more contingent than we tend to remember. The other thing that's happened, obviously, has been generational change. For my generation, the memory of genocide, the memory of fascism, was still a burning issue for someone as I am born after the Second World War. But to the younger generation, the never again fascism has receded as a guiding principle in our commitment to democracy. A generation, part of the crisis of liberal democracy is the failure of my generation to transmit our allergic fear of genocide and fascism to our children and grandchildren. Now, and much of your research has looked on this in very interesting ways. Your research also shows that these transnational geopolitical trends that I've been talking about have played out in very different ways in each national context. One of the things that makes this project so fascinating to me is that you're trying to tease out transcending shared strands in authoritarian illiberal developments that are specific to the national political cultures of each society. And that, I think, is where your project has done fantastic stuff. Illiberal regimes like Hungary, Slovakia, Poland under peace, and illiberal parties like Meloni, Wilders, the AFD, National Rally in France, and Nigel Farage in the UK don't have the same reaction to the transformation of the global order. Some right-wing powers that are in power want to remain in NATO while they court Trump memes in their domestic politics. Other right-wing populists like Farage in Britain want to, stay out of the EU. AFD is overtly hostile to NATO. So each of these illiberal parties is configuring themselves differently in terms of the emerging geopolitical context. Many are hostile to global free trade and the dominance that it confers on China and the United States, and they're opposed to that because it weakens national economic sovereignty. Almost all of them are hostile to migration, especially to the model of multicultural toleration as an appealing national identity. That's the national identity I grew up loving and believing, but it is under enormous attack everywhere. Most illiberal challengers, and here I just lift this straight off Jolt Ennedy's extremely useful typology, seem to favor closed borders, closed societies, centralized politics, and a partisan state. That gets the commonalities, it seems to me, very well. But I want to, since I'm talking about geopolitics, talk a little bit about the contradictions in the illiberal authoritarian reaction to the new geopolitical world, because the contradictions are extremely fascinating to me. One of them is Viktor Orban. Viktor Orban, as you know, castigates the European Union and transnational forms of authority Monday through Friday, and then, as long as he could, he cashed the EU checks on Saturday. He's a member of NATO to this day, but won't allow transshipment of materiel to Ukraine. He wants the benefits of transnational inscription of his sovereignty because it gives him progression. And he also wants the luxury of running against all these transnational forms Monday through Friday to maintain his electoral base. How long authoritarian liberalism can keep this up is anybody's guess, and how long NATO and EU are going to tolerate that is a matter of wonder to me. But now, contradictions bother theorists and academics like us, but contradictions don't bother voters nearly as much, provided the policy generates results, particularly economic ones, that they like. The English have this wonderful saying, consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. Consistency is a virtue to us, not necessarily a virtue for electorates. So if you shift for a moment and ask the question, how do these illiberal authoritarian regimes view the new geopolitical order? I think you have to remember always they are in small, weak countries at the mercy, ultimately, of predators, the United States, China, and Russia. In that situation, it's rational for a small country to maximize state power, to centralize authority, and seek, to the degree that you can, to play larger states against each other, gaining political benefits at home by protecting yourself as a defender of your country, defying your protectors on the one hand, while benefiting from their protection on the other. The strategy is contradictory, but it seems to have worked for someone like Orban. It's important to pay tribute to the extremely chameleon-like skill with which he has masked these contradictions and used these contradictions to maintain power. He is now aided by a significant development in the geopolitical situation, which you'll be aware of from J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference and also from the National Security Strategy, in which it is clear for the first time in 80 years that the principle by which America will decide whether they are a European party or government is a friend or foe is their ideological alignment with Trump's particular ideological configuration. So suddenly the criteria for American support is not the democratic institutional structure of a particular society, but the ideological configuration of a government alone. And Vance has conjured up a new European alliance of patriotic parties, and this gives hope to the illiberal authoritarians that you've been studying. And the encouragement that this gives is crucial to their metaphysical sense that they are in the vanguard and advance of history. I want to stress that because I think there's a historical metaphysics at work in illiberal authoritarianism that is worth paying attention to, best summarized by what I think is Viktor Orban's most brilliant remark. Once faced with criticism from Western Europeans, he's supposed to have said, "We used to think you were our future. Now we think we are your future." In that is encapsulated a whole sense of a historical Weltanschauung. And at the moment, it seems to me, the geopolitical situation is confirming the authoritarian illiberals in this sense that they are on history's side. Now, having laid out, as I see it, the interaction between geopolitics and illiberal politics at the domestic level, let me conclude with some thoughts about how European liberal Democrats might respond to this experience of adversity. Catastrophizing, the psychologists say, is only irrational if you don't end up doing something about what you're anxious about. So the test of how we respond is not what we think alone, although thinking is what we do, but how we act. And so the question is, what is the rational European response to this transformation of global politics? I certainly don't have the answer, but I can suggest a few places where we might start. One response to American desertion of Europe is to seek strength in numbers. And European states are now investing on joint defense projects, assuming most of the burden of keeping Ukraine in the fight, working together to deter and neutralize Russian disinformation and destabilization of democracies. But now it seems to me Europe is approaching an absolute fork in the road in terms of its capacity to hold back illiberal authoritarianism, both at the geopolitical level and at the domestic level, because figures like Mario Draghi, as you know, have argued that Europe will be unable to rival the economic power of China and America, especially in emerging technologies, unless it creates a single market in capital, labor, and services. Without that kind of economic aggregation, Europe will not be able to create economic units large enough, sufficiently capitalized, to compete on a global scale with Chinese and American rivals. We tend to think of Draghi's report as a kind of agenda for economic revival. I think it's quite important for this group to understand this is the precondition for the survival of liberal democracy, in my view. You can't have liberal democracy if European standards of living begin to decline and this continent turns into a culture of museums and nostalgia and regret. I mean, just that's what I think Draghi has got right. But the challenge, and this group is particularly attuned to see what the challenge is that Draghi's agenda requires the further concentration of economic and political power in Europe, and the opponents, illiberal Democrats, are fighting precisely that, the further concentration and centralization of economic and political power in Europe. And the illiberal populist base depends on rousing and holding on to and exaggerating wherever possible quite obvious, deep-rooted fears that with the surrender of sovereignty upwards to Brussels, European citizens, particularly in the countryside, will lose the things they love and care about. And so there is an overt contradiction between a strategy of survival that requires aggregation of power, creation of common markets across the 27, and the political drivers that are sustaining illiberal democracy in the 27 member states. The challenge for defenders of liberal democracy is to convince European voters that the best way to defend national identity of each member of the Union is to transfer some national sovereignty upwards, so that a single market, a single defense policy, a single foreign policy, a single immigration policy, sealing borders while maintaining a strong legal immigration stream, will become the guarantee of the sovereignty of all. But this has been the liberal democratic challenge in Europe all along, persuading reluctant voters that the best hope for maintaining sovereignty as actors on the global stage is to pool sovereignty within Europe to give each of the 27 the global power that none can achieve alone. And it's been the failure, not just in the last 10 years, but over the last 40 years, to achieve that objective, to get global economic power and political coherence for united Europe, combined with a failure of many of these states to be effective sovereigns at home, that I would argue is the single reason why liberal democracy faces an illiberal challenge at home right across Europe. The illiberal challenge, by promising to close borders, close societies, centralize authority, responds to the failure of liberal sovereigns to police their borders, maintain order, and deliver economic and social protection, and the failure of the Union as a whole to amplify European power on the global stage, and to demonstrate in practical ways that pooled sovereignty is the best way to enhance the sovereignty of each state. All this strikes me as the crucial geopolitical dimension of the rise of a liberal authority in Europe. Now, I've done some catastrophizing. I've tried to be suggestive about what at the upper macro level might be a solution. But I do think that diagnosis is the precondition for treatment, and treatment is the precondition for cure, and that's why I'm such a passionate believer in what we're trying to do here. The more we understand authoritarian illiberalism, the better we will be. We can't have too much of what we're trying to do in this room. And I'm convinced that accurate diagnosis of the kind this project has delivered for the past number of years gives us hope that treatment is possible for the ailments that threaten liberal democracy, and that a cure remains possible. But I hardly need tell you, the hour is late. And cures depend on qualities that are always in very, very short supply in every society: leadership, skill, and courage. Thanks for your attention.